You were taught that kindness is a virtue, that being good, being generous, being agreeable, these are the qualities of a person worth respecting, worth loving, worth following. Machiavelli read that belief. He studied it carefully. He watched it play out across courts and kingdoms and corridors of power for decades. And then he wrote something that has made people deeply uncomfortable for 500 years. He wrote that kindness unchecked, unstrategic, blindly given is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability, and in the wrong hands, it will be used to destroy you. This is not a video about becoming cruel. This is a video about waking up, because the most dangerous person in your life is not your enemy. It is the version of you that keeps giving to people who have already shown you exactly who they are. Let's be clear about what Machiavelli was and was not saying. He was not saying the world should be without compassion. He was not celebrating cruelty for its own sake. He was not writing a manual for monsters. He was writing a survival guide for anyone who refused to keep being naive about human nature. In The Prince, Machiavelli made an observation that cut through centuries of comfortable moral teaching like a blade through silk. He said that a man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to ruin among so many who are not good. Read that carefully. Not that goodness is wrong, that making it your entire profession, your entire strategy, your entire identity in a world where not everyone shares that commitment is a form of self-destruction dressed up as virtue. Machiavelli had a unique vantage point from which to observe this. He was not a theorist sitting in a comfortable study. He was a diplomat, a political advisor, a man who moved through the most dangerous corridors of Renaissance, Italian politics where alliances shifted overnight, where the generous prince became the exploited prince within a single season, and where survival belonged not to the most virtuous, but to the most clear-eyed. He watched good men fall, over and over again, not because they lacked talent or intelligence or even goodness of heart, but because they confused being good with being wise, because they treated the world as it should be rather than as it was, and because they gave their trust, their loyalty, their resources, and their energy to people and systems that never intended to honor any of it. The world rewards strategic kindness. It devours unconditional kindness. And most people have never been taught the difference because no one who benefits from your unconditional giving has any incentive to teach you. Today, we are going to learn it through 10 uncomfortable truths that Machiavelli's life's work points directly toward. 10 truths about kindness, generosity, and what happens when good people forget to also be wise ones. Stay until the end, because the final truth is the one that changes how you see everything that came before it. Truth number 1. Kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It is submission. There is a version of kindness that comes from strength. It is chosen. It is deliberate. It is given freely because the person giving it has enough security, enough self-respect, enough internal power that giving costs them nothing essential. And then there is the other kind, the kindness that comes from fear, from the desperate need to be liked, from the terror of conflict and the exhausting performance of pleasantness, designed to keep everyone comfortable, except yourself. Machiavelli saw this version everywhere. Rulers who agreed to terms they shouldn't have agreed to because they didn't want to seem harsh. Generals who spared enemies who came back and destroyed them. Advisors who told princes what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to hear, and called it kindness. He called it something else. He called it weakness wearing a disguise. The person who cannot say no is not kind. They are afraid. The person who gives endlessly without regard for whether the giving is deserved, reciprocated, or sustainable is not generous. They are avoiding the discomfort of honesty, and the people around them, consciously or not, can feel the difference. People do not ultimately respect the person who never pushes back. They may enjoy them, they may use them, but they do not respect them, because somewhere beneath the surface, everyone understands that true kindness requires a choice, and a choice requires the freedom to also say no. Think about what happens in the body of a person who cannot stop being kind even when they desperately want to. The clenched jaw through another unreasonable request. The smile held in place while internally screaming. The slow, quiet erosion of self that happens every single time you choose someone else's comfort over your own truth. That erosion doesn't stay invisible forever. It surfaces as resentment, as exhaustion, as a bitterness that the kind person often cannot even fully explain because they have been telling themselves for so long that they are fine, they are happy to help. It's no problem at all. It is a problem. It has always been a problem. And Machiavelli was simply the one willing to say so. The moment your kindness becomes something you cannot stop even when you want to, it is no longer kindness. It is submission. And submission, dressed as virtue, is the most expensive costume you will ever wear. The practice: identify one relationship in your life where you have been consistently kind in ways that have not been reciprocated. Ask yourself honestly, is this kindness or is this fear? The answer to that question is worth more than any advice anyone has ever given you. Truth number 2, generosity has a breaking point, and Machiavelli knew exactly where it was. One of Machiavelli's most counterintuitive chapters in The Prince deals with generosity, and it begins with a warning that almost no one sees coming. He writes that a prince who is too generous will eventually be forced to tax his people heavily to sustain that generosity. And when the taxes come, the people who benefited most from his generosity will be the first to hate him for it. Let that sit for a moment. The people you give the most to will turn on you the fastest when the giving stops. This is not a cynical fantasy. This is a pattern so consistent across human history that Machiavelli didn't even treat it as controversial. He treated it as arithmetic, as obvious as the fact that what goes out must eventually be replenished, and replenishment always has a cost that someone has to pay. Unstrategic generosity creates dependency, and dependency left unchecked creates entitlement. The person who receives without limit begins unconsciously, automatically to see the receiving as a right rather than a gift. And when the gift is eventually reduced or withdrawn, the entitlement doesn't disappear. It transforms into resentment. You have seen this, maybe in a workplace where the most accommodating employee is also the most taken for granted. Maybe in a friendship where the most giving person is also the one who gets called last. Maybe in a family dynamic where the person who does the most quietly receives the least acknowledgement because everyone has simply come to expect it. Here is the deeper psychological mechanism at work. When you give consistently without requiring anything in return, not gratitude, not reciprocity, not even acknowledgement, you are training the people around you to relate to you as a resource rather than a person. And resources are not people. The moment you stop giving, whether because you ran out or burned out or finally decided you had given enough, the people who had learned to rely on your endless supply do not see it as your right to stop. They see it as your failure to perform a function they had come to depend on. And that is the moment generosity curdled into resentment. Machiavelli's counsel was not to stop giving. It was to give in ways that build rather than deplete. To be strategically generous, meaning your generosity should have a direction, a purpose, and a limit. Not because generosity is wrong, but because generosity without boundaries is a loan with no repayment date, accumulating interest that will eventually be collected from the most painful part of you. The practice: look at where your energy, time, and resources are going this week. For each major expenditure of generosity, ask, is this building something? Is this reciprocated over time? Does this person know that what I am giving is a choice, not an obligation? If none of those answers are yes, you are not being generous. You are being drained. Truth number 3, being liked and being respected are not the same thing. This may be the most painful truth in the entire video, because most people who overgive, over-accommodate, and over-apologize are doing it for one reason. They want to be liked. They want warmth. They want to be the person others speak well of, feel comfortable around, and choose to keep close. And Machiavelli would say you may get exactly what you want and it will cost you everything you actually need. He drew a sharp, clear line between love and respect, between being liked and being taken seriously. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot have both, not because fear is a goal, but because fear in Machiavelli's vocabulary meant something specific. It meant being taken seriously. It meant consequences being real. It meant your word having weight. And here is the uncomfortable truth about extreme likability. It often works against weight. The person who is endlessly agreeable, endlessly warm, endlessly accommodating becomes, in other people's minds, endlessly available. And what is always available is never precious. Think about the people in your life you most deeply respect. They are probably not the ones who agreed with everything you said. They are probably the ones who occasionally pushed back, who had standards, who said no when they meant no and yes when they meant yes, and whose approval precisely, because it wasn't guaranteed, meant something when it came. That is not harshness, that is integrity. And integrity, not warmth, is the foundation of genuine respect. There is a social experiment that plays out in every workplace, every social circle, every family. Take the person who never says no, who always volunteers, who smiles through every imposition and apologizes for things that aren't their fault. Now ask the others in that group what they think of that person. They will say they love them. They are so sweet. They are always there for everyone. Now ask who gets the most important assignments. Who gets consulted when the real decisions are made? Who is taken into confidence when something serious is at stake? It will almost never be the most accommodating person in the room, because accommodating people are comfortable. They are not threatening. They are not challenging. And challenging, as uncomfortable as it sounds, is the quality that signals to others that you have something worth taking seriously. Machiavelli was not telling you to stop being warm. He was telling you that warmth offered indiscriminately becomes invisible. But warmth that is earned, warmth given by a person who is also capable of withholding it, becomes one of the most powerful things one human being can offer another. Truth. Number 4. People mistake your patience for permission. Here is something Machiavelli observed in court after court, prince after prince. And it is something that will feel immediately familiar to anyone who has ever been the steady, reliable, patient one in any relationship. When you consistently absorb bad behavior without consequence, you are not demonstrating grace. You are issuing an invitation, not intentionally, not consciously, but the signal your patience sends over time is this: this behavior is acceptable here. There are no consequences. This person can be pushed further. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the danger of delayed correction. He argued that problems left unaddressed do not stay the same size. They grow, not because the person causing them is necessarily malicious, but because the absence of resistance reads as absence of objection, and absence of objection reads as agreement. Think about the relationship in your life where someone started with small transgressions, small intrusions, small dismissals or disrespects that you absorbed because you wanted to be the bigger person, because you didn't want to cause drama, because you told yourself it wasn't worth making a thing of. And then it got worse, because it always gets worse. Not always out of cruelty, sometimes simply because the boundary was never drawn clearly enough for the other person to see it. They didn't know they were crossing a line, because from where they stood, there was no line. There was only your smiling, accommodating, endlessly patient face, absorbing everything and calling it peace. Machiavelli's lesson was stark on this point. Address the small fires. Address them clearly, promptly, and without apology. Because a small fire addressed immediately costs almost nothing, but the same fire, left to grow while you practice patience, will eventually consume the entire structure. This is not about becoming someone who overreacts to every small slight. It is about understanding that your silence has a language, that your patience communicates something, and what it communicates, in the absence of any other signal, is that you can be treated this way, that this is the standard you accept. You are not required to accept it. You never were, but you have to say so clearly, calmly and early, before the other person has spent so long treating you that way that a correction feels to them like an attack. The practice: identify one pattern of behavior in your life that you have tolerated longer than you should have. Not a dramatic betrayal, a small, repeated thing that has quietly been wearing you down. Name it out loud to yourself. Then decide clearly and deliberately what you will and will not accept going forward. And the next time it happens, say something, calmly, without drama, but without silence. Truth number 5. Forgiving too quickly is a form of self-betrayal. Machiavelli observed something in the courts he served that almost no one wants to hear in polite company. He observed that those who forgave too quickly were almost always betrayed again, not always by evil people, sometimes by ordinary ones, because what premature forgiveness communicates, beneath its surface of grace and maturity, is that there are no real consequences for hurting you, that the relationship is more important to you than your own boundaries, that your need for harmony is greater than your need for accountability. And people, even good people, even people who love you, will unconsciously test those limits again once they discover they exist without real enforcement. This is not an argument against forgiveness. Forgiveness, in its truest form, is one of the most powerful things a human being can do. But there is a crucial distinction that Machiavelli's framework demands we make. The distinction between forgiving and forgetting, between releasing your anger internally and restoring trust externally as if nothing happened. Internal forgiveness, releasing the grip of bitterness from your own mind, is for you. It is self-preservation. Holding on to resentment corrodes the person holding it far more than the person it is aimed at. But behavioral restoration, treating someone exactly as you did before they showed you who they were, that is not forgiveness. That is erasure. And when you erase what someone showed you, you are not being gracious. You are being complicit in what happens next. The most common form this takes is the apology cycle. Someone hurts you. They apologize, sincerely or otherwise. You forgive them completely and immediately, because the discomfort of holding them accountable is greater than the discomfort of the original hurt. Everything returns to exactly how it was. And then, weeks or months or sometimes years later, the same thing happens again. Because the apology was accepted as currency, and the currency bought a full reset with no real consequence and no real change. Machiavelli's lesson: see clearly, remember accurately. Forgive internally for your own peace, but adjust your trust externally based on what you have actually witnessed, not based on what you wish were true, and not based on the apology that always sounds most sincere right after the damage is done. Truth number 6. The world does not reward the most kind, it rewards the most prepared. Here is where Machiavelli becomes most ruthlessly practical. He had no patience for the belief that virtue alone produces good outcomes. He had watched too many virtuous people lose too many important battles to believe that goodness was a reliable strategy on its own. He wrote that fortune, the unpredictable force of circumstances, favors the bold and the prepared, not the good, not the deserving, not the kind, the prepared. This does not mean kindness has no place in the world. It means kindness divorced from strategy, from preparation, from the willingness to protect yourself, is simply hope dressed up as a plan. And hope, as any general who has ever lost a war could tell you, is not a plan. The most painful version of this truth plays out constantly. The employee who works the hardest and gives the most, who assumes that their dedication will be noticed and rewarded, and watches someone else, more politically aware, more strategically visible, receive the promotion. The friend who is always available, always supportive, always there, and is still somehow the one who gets left behind when everyone's lives evolve. The partner who gives everything and assumes love is its own insurance, and finds out too late that love without communication and strategy is not enough to sustain a life together. It is not that the world is purely cruel. It is that the world is indifferent. It does not keep score of your goodness. It responds to what is visible, what is positioned, what is strategically placed to be noticed and valued. Machiavelli spent years watching princes who were good men lose. everything to princes who were strategic men, and his conclusion was not that goodness should be abandoned. It was that goodness, to survive, must be paired with intelligence, with awareness, with the willingness to understand the systems you are operating inside and to position yourself accordingly. Being good in a system that does not reward goodness without adapting your strategy is not virtue. It is stubbornness. And stubborn virtue does not save anyone. It just makes the fall feel more unfair. Truth, the 7, your kindness, can become someone else's weapon. This is the truth that hits the hardest. And Machiavelli did not flinch from it. There are people in the world, not many, but enough, who specifically seek out the kind ones, who look for the generous, the empathetic, the endlessly accommodating, and who use those qualities as entry points, as tools, as the exact mechanism by which they gain access to what they want. They do not target the hard ones, the boundaried ones, the ones who say no comfortably and without apology. They target the ones whose need to be kind is strong enough to override their self-protection. Because that need, that beautiful, genuine, deeply human need, becomes, in the wrong hands, a lever. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must learn to be both the lion and the fox. The lion for confronting what threatens openly, the fox for recognizing traps before walking into them. And the traps, he observed, are rarely labeled. They usually arrive dressed as need, as vulnerability, as the story that pulls on exactly the part of you most willing to give. The most sophisticated version of this is not malicious in the way we typically imagine manipulation to be. It does not arrive with a villain's face. It arrives as someone who needs you, who recognizes your capacity for care and leans into it, not because they planned it with cold deliberation, but because they have learned, through a lifetime of relating to people, that need gets results from certain kinds of people, and certain kinds of people, the generous ones, the empathetic ones, the ones who feel guilty for saying no, are exquisitely responsive to need. This does not mean become suspicious of everyone who expresses vulnerability. Vulnerability is real. Need is real. Human beings genuinely need each other, and that is not a weakness, it is a fact. But there is a difference between someone who is vulnerable and also growing, also reciprocating, also building something alongside you, and someone whose vulnerability is a permanent state that always requires more of you than they ever offer in return. The kindest thing you can do for yourself and ultimately for the people who genuinely deserve your generosity is to make your kindness something that has to be deserved, not withheld, not weaponized in the other direction, but earned through demonstrated integrity, through reciprocity, through the slow and genuine building of trust. Truth the 8, over-explaining. Yourself is kindness turned against. You, this one is subtle, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who constantly justifies his decisions invites everyone to question them. That explanation, offered without request, is a form of seeking approval, and seeking approval is a form of dependence. And dependence, in any power dynamic, shifts the balance away from you. But there is a kindness dimension to this that Machiavelli's framework illuminates in a specific way. Many people over-explain not out of insecurity but out of kindness. They want the other person to understand. They want the refusal to be cushioned. They want the boundary to feel gentle enough that no one is upset by it. So they explain and elaborate and qualify and soften until the original boundary has been buried under so many layers of consideration that it can barely be found. And what the other person hears in all of that explanation is not kindness. What they hear is an opening. Every reason you give for a decision is a reason that can be argued with. Every justification is a potential counter-argument. Every piece of emotional scaffolding you build around a no gives the other person something to dismantle. And people who want what they want are very good at dismantling. The kindest communicators in Machiavelli's framework are actually the most economical ones. They say what they mean. They do not over-decorate it. They do not apologize for their own clarity. They offer the decision, not the deliberation. And in doing so, they protect both themselves and the other person from the exhausting negotiation that over-explanation always invites. There is also something deeply respectful about a clean, clear answer. It treats the other person as capable of handling a direct response. It does not condescend to them with excessive softening. It does not perform guilt in order to seem more palatable. It simply says what is true and trusts the other person to be an adult about it. That is not unkind. That is honest. And honest, delivered with care but without apology, is one of the highest forms of respect one person can offer another. Truth number 9, the cost of people-pleasing, is paid in the currency of your potential. This truth sits at the deepest level of what Machiavelli was pointing toward, and it is the one most likely to stay with you long after this video ends. Every hour you spend managing other people's feelings about your choices is an hour you are not spending on the choices themselves. Every unit of energy that goes into smoothing over the discomfort of people who do not like who you are. Becoming is energy that does not go into the becoming. People-pleasing is expensive. Not just emotionally, structurally. It costs you time. It costs you focus. It costs you the willingness to make decisions that are right for your life, but unpopular with the people in it. And those decisions, the unpopular but necessary ones, are almost always the ones that determine the actual trajectory of a life. Machiavelli understood this in the context of governance. The prince who made every decision based on what would be most popular, in the moment invariably, made terrible long-term decisions, because what is popular in the moment is almost never what is wise in the long term. The crowd cheers for easy. The crowd cheers for generous. The crowd cheers for the thing that makes them feel good right now, and the prince who lives for that applause will sacrifice the future to receive it. In your own life, the crowd is the collection of voices, some external, some internal, that tell you what you are allowed to want, how large you are permitted to grow, what risks are acceptable, what ambitions are appropriate for someone like you. And the people-pleasing impulse, the deeply trained, often generationally inherited instinct to keep the peace at the cost of the self, is the mechanism by which that crowd keeps its influence. Every time you shrink a dream because someone might not approve, the crowd wins. Every time you take the safer path because the bolder one would require you to disappoint someone, the crowd wins. Every time you silence an authentic impulse in order to maintain a harmony that was never really real, the crowd wins. And you lose something. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually in the accumulation of all the things you chose not to do because you were too busy being what everyone else needed you to be. Machiavelli's most enduring lesson was this: you cannot build anything of lasting value on the foundation of other people's approval, because approval is not a foundation. It is a weather pattern. It shifts with the wind, with the season, with the interests and moods of those dispensing it. And anything built on weather does not stand. Build on what is yours, your values, your vision, your willingness to be misunderstood in the short term in service of something that matters in the long one. Truth number 10. The most powerful form of kindness is selective. And here, finally, is where Machiavelli's framework reveals something that almost no one expects. It reveals something genuinely beautiful. Because everything Machiavelli wrote about the dangers of indiscriminate kindness points toward a single destination, not toward coldness, not toward isolation, not toward the hardened, closed-off person who has decided that self-protection means never giving anything to anyone. It points toward something far more powerful than any of that. It points toward the person who gives from fullness rather than from fear, who is kind because they have chosen to be, not because they are afraid of what happens if they are not, who is generous because they have enough security, enough self-respect, enough internal abundance that what they give genuinely costs them nothing essential. That kind of kindness changes people, not because it is louder or more dramatic than the anxious, boundaryless version, but because it is real. Because the person receiving it can feel the difference between being given to by someone who cannot stop giving and being given to by someone who could stop but has chosen not to. The first creates dependency. The second creates genuine connection. Think about the most meaningful act of kindness anyone has ever shown you. It probably was not from the person who gave to everyone indiscriminately. It was from someone who did not have to, whose time or attention or care was genuinely valuable because it was not automatically on offer to everyone. And when they gave it to you, you knew it meant something, because you knew they had chosen. That is what selective kindness creates: meaning, weight, genuine, warmth that the recipient can trust, because they understand it was earned rather than automatic. Machiavelli's hidden truth, the one buried beneath all the warnings and the political cynicism and the uncomfortable observations about human nature, is this: kindness is not the problem. Weakness disguised as kindness is the problem. The world does not need fewer kind people. It needs more people who are kind from a position of genuine strength, who have done the hard work of building boundaries, of understanding their own value, of learning to say no without guilt and yes without resentment, who give their warmth, their generosity, their compassion deliberately, selectively, powerfully. That version of kindness cannot be weaponized, cannot be used against you, cannot drain you or diminish you or leave you hollow and wondering where you went. That version of kindness is, as Machiavelli's entire body of work quietly points toward, the most powerful thing a human being can offer the world.